Tonight we're going to be looking at studying Numbers chapter 17 through 19. If you haven't printed off a sheet, I hope you'll go online and do that and fill that out beforehand and kind of help you out in covering some of these studies and getting a little bit better understanding and a little bit more knowledge when it comes to studying these chapters. But it's going to deal with the idea of responsibility. And so if you have your handout with you, I invite you to look at question number 1. And if you join us regularly in our adult class, you know that usually we begin with a question that kind of introduces the idea or the subject at hand that we're going to study any particular night. And so question number 1 on your handout is, what do you hope to teach your children about responsibility? And I think all of us who are parents, and I guess I should say all of us who profess to be good parents, are trying to instill within our children the idea of responsibility. When you think about responsibility, what is it exactly we're trying to teach them? Well, the two things that really pop into my mind. The first one would be, number one, to be responsible. And of course, when we think about being responsible, we're talking about, if there's something that you're supposed to do, go ahead and do that. If somebody's counting on you to do something, if it's your job, then make sure that job gets done. And the second one really has to do more with the idea of, responsibility isn't just getting things done that are supposed to be done, but it's also doing them the right way, doing them the way that they're supposed to be done. And so being responsible isn't just checking something off your to-do list, but it's also doing what you're supposed to do, but doing it right, doing a good job when it comes to it. And the reason that we're looking at that idea, and that begins our subject tonight, is because when you look at Moses and the leadership of Israel, they had a tremendous responsibility. Moses, of course, we think about as the leader of the children of Israel. Oftentimes we think, well, there's a tremendous load and responsibility that was placed upon him, and that's true. But there were a lot of other people who were in positions of leadership that also had tremendous responsibility. And of course, some of them that we're going to study about tonight, Aaron, the high priest, a lot of responsibility that was laid upon him personally as the high priest, but also as his sons who would follow in his footsteps and who were priests too. And then the Levites, the tribe of Levi in general, had a tremendous responsibility that was placed upon them. And so what are we talking about when we're talking about responsibility? Well, we're talking about they had a job to do. And if they weren't responsible, if they didn't perform that job, nobody else was going to do it. God was relying upon them. And not only did they have to do that job, but also they had to do it the right way. Part of the responsibility that they had is making sure that the right sacrifices got offered at the right times. The right things were done in service and worship to God. And so with those things in mind, I invite you to turn over with me to Numbers chapter 17. Obviously, we've got 3 chapters tonight. There's no way we're going to be able to read all the verses within that chapter. And so we'll just kind of skip around through it and kind of highlight some of the main points that are in keeping with our lesson. But if you begin reading in about the first 7 verses of Numbers 17, you'll find that, thinking back, I guess, previously to some of the chapters before, Moses' authority had been challenged. And not just Moses' authority, but also Aaron's authority and the Levites' authority. Remember the children of Israel asked the question, who put you in charge? All of us are holy. All of us are God's children. What makes the tribe of Levi so special that they're the ones who get to be the priests, and they're the ones who get to serve in the different aspects that were involved in the tabernacle itself. And so you had the great rebellion of Korah. God showed through it. Of course, Moses was supposed to be the leader. But remember that the day after that, there were a group of people that came to Moses and Aaron, and they basically said, why are you killing God's children? They held them responsible for the deaths of those 250 men that had rebelled against the authority of Moses and of Aaron. And so you kind of had this ongoing idea or conflict involving the leadership itself. And so what God proposes in the first part of Numbers chapter 17 is a test. And the test involved each tribe taking a staff, basically a piece of dried wood, old wood, no life within it, but a piece of dried wood, everybody writing the name of their tribe on it, and everybody writing their name as a representative of that tribe, 12, of course, from each of those tribes. Moses was to take those staffs and those pieces of dried wood and to bring it in and to set it before the testimony of God. And so if you go down to about verse 8 in Numbers chapter 17, we read about the results of that. It says, "Now it came to pass on the next day that Moses went into the tabernacle of witness, and behold, the rod of Aaron of the house of Levi had sprouted and put forth buds, and had produced blossoms and yielded ripe almonds. Then Moses brought out all the rods from before the Lord to all the children of Israel, and they looked, and each man took his rod. And the Lord said to Moses, Bring Aaron's rod back before the testimony to be kept as a sign against the rebels, that you may put their complaints away from me, lest they die. Thus did Moses, just as the Lord had commanded him, so he did. So the children of Israel spoke to Moses, saying, Surely we die, we perish, we all perish. Whoever even comes near to the tabernacle of the Lord must die. Shall we all utterly die? And so if you look at question number 2 on your handout, the question is, how was Aaron's staff to be a sign for the people of Israel? Well, obviously we read there how the next day after he put those staffs representative of those tribes before the testimony of God, that the proof was in the fact that Aaron's rod had sprouted. It began growing buds. Not only had it budded, it had also had blossoms on it, the Bible said, and it also had almonds. It also yielded fruit. And so that staff was to be a sign to the children of Israel that Aaron was God's choice for the high priesthood, and that the tribe of Levi was the choice as to be involved in the service of the tabernacle. And when you think about it, again, you kind of had this ongoing question, this lingering question, well, who should be in charge? You know, this evidence, whenever God presented this to the children of Israel, it needed to be strong evidence. You know, it needed to be something that without a doubt would prove that Aaron and the tribe of Levi were the ones who were supposed to be involved in the service of the tabernacle. And so what God did, you think about it from a human standpoint, I mean, it involved an impossibility, humanly speaking. Dead wood doesn't sprout, number one. It doesn't blossom, you know, it doesn't bear any fruit of any kind. And you take all of that with the fact that this happened overnight. I mean, that's you can't take even a live tree, you know, doesn't blossom or doesn't sprout and blossom and yield fruit just overnight. It just doesn't happen all in the same night. And so it was to be a sign for the children of Israel. Everybody else's rod was given back to them, but Aaron's rod was to be kept, and it was to be put into the Ark of the Covenant. Remember now, there's basically 3 things that have been laid up in the Ark of the Covenant to this point. And then they all involve the idea of important events or reminders to the children of Israel. You have the 10 Commandments, the giving of the law at Mount Sinai. And then you have the pot of manna, of course, which reminded the children of Israel of God providing for them when they were in the wilderness. And then you have Aaron's rod that budded to remind the people, you know, a testimony forever that Aaron was to be the high priest and the Levites were supposed to be those who were involved in the service of the tabernacle and not some other tribe. And so when you get over into chapter 19, or chapter 18, excuse me, we kind of get, we start to read about some of the responsibilities that was involved in being a high priest, and also in the tribe of Levi in serving in the tabernacle itself. And so if you look in verse 1 of chapter 18, it says, Then the Lord said to Aaron, You and your sons and your father's house with you shall bear the iniquity related to the sanctuary, and you and your sons with you shall bear the iniquity associated with your priesthood. And question number 3 involves this verse here. It says, For what did the Lord tell Aaron he and his sons were responsible? And basically, as we read there in verse 1, basically what God tells to Aaron and those involved, you know, their job was to take care of the sin that related, any sin that would involve the tabernacle, any sin that would involve the service of the tabernacle. Their job was to take care of that. And of course, you think about the sins of all the people. Again, we're talking about millions of people here. How many times in a day would people violate God's law, and they would have to go to the tabernacle, and of course it involves some kind of sacrifice for their sin. Well, that responsibility, that huge responsibility, was laid upon Aaron and the tribe of Levi. And of course, their job would have been, when people came, their job would have been to teach them, well, what does the law require in this instance? What does the law of God say? And so their job was to teach people how to approach God, also to keep them from offering the wrong type of sacrifice, make sure their sins were forgiven. So a tremendous, huge responsibility was laid upon them. You'll read a little bit more about that through about verse 5. And then we kind of get into the idea of the duties of the Levites, the responsibilities of the Levites themselves. And they differed, of course, from Aaron and his sons. Notice verses 6 and 7 here. It says, "Behold, I myself have taken your brethren, the Levites, from among the children of Israel. They are a gift to you, given by the Lord, to do the work of the tabernacle of meeting. Therefore you and your sons with you shall attend to your priesthood for everything at the altar and behind the veil. And you shall serve, I give your priesthood to you as a gift for service, but the outsider who comes near shall be put to death." And so question number 4 was, how were the responsibilities of Aaron's sons and of course the Levites, how were they different from one another? Well, the Levites weren't directly involved in all the sacrifices and also in the articles involved in the service of the tabernacle. Remember, that was a responsibility that was laid solely upon Aaron and his sons. But the Levites, I guess we could kind of describe them as maybe being assistants. Their job was to basically help any way that they could when it came to the service of the tabernacle. There were exceptions, of course, to what they could do. If you read within those verses, they weren't supposed to come close to any of the holy things. They weren't supposed to touch any of those holy articles. That was Aaron's job and his son's job to take care of those things. Their job was not to be a priest. Their job was not to stand in when Aaron wasn't around or where any of his sons weren't around. Their job wasn't to try to replace them in any way, but basically to help take care of the tabernacle any way that they could without directly approaching the holy things or touching those holy things. And again, we're talking about millions of people offering sacrifice every day. There was plenty for the Levites to do to help prepare those animals, get those things ready, and of course clean up and things like that they would have been involved in. So they did have a responsibility. It was different than the responsibility that Aaron and his sons had, but it was just as important because it all involved the idea of taking care of the sins of the children of Israel. Question number 5 is, what do you think made it necessary for the Levites to have specific responsibilities? We've already read how the Levites had been chosen by God. They're described, in fact, in those verses we read in 6 and 7 to Aaron as a gift from God. You have this idea that God loves his people. Obviously, God cared for the Israelites, and God wanted them taken care of, and that's especially true when it comes to the spiritual side of their lives. Obviously, he took care of them physically, but he also wanted to make sure that their sins were taken care of, and so that responsibility was laid upon Aaron and his sons and the Levites to take care of all the things that pertained to those to taking care of those sins. And it's just like any job, I think about, the idea of building a house. You don't just set out with a group of 20 men and say, well, we're going to build a house and not divide up responsibility. It always takes the idea of, this is your job. Maybe one guy's in charge of framing, maybe one guy's in charge of the concrete, maybe one guy's in charge of electricity, one guy's in charge of sheetrock, and on and on and on you can go. But it takes assigning somebody a specific responsibility in order to accomplish a task. And so God didn't just sit down with Aaron and his sons and the Levites and say, well, your job is to take care of the sins of the people, and not give specific responsibilities. It has to be that way in order for anything to get done or to get accomplished. And so God divvied up the responsibility Everybody didn't do the same thing, but each played an integral part in fulfilling the ultimate goal and purpose, and that was to make sure that the people were taken care of when it came to their spiritual needs, and see the right sacrifices were offered for their sins. You can read verses 8 through 19, and we're not going to do that because of time, but if you do read that, you'll find about how Aaron and his sons and the Levites, how God made provisions for them so that they didn't have to go out and work or be involved in everyday work, so that their focus could be on the tabernacle and of taking care of the sins of the people. And so question number 6 on your handout asks the question, what were Aaron and his sons given as priests of the Lord? And basically, we could generalize it and say, well, they were given support, or they were given an income. Not every sacrifice that was brought was completely burned up to God. I mean, sometimes when we think about sacrifices, we think, well, everything that the people brought from the animals and the grain and the drink offerings and things like that, they were all just burned up. But that wasn't the case. Now, some of them were, but not all of them were. And so there were portions of those sacrifices that weren't used, that weren't burned up, but yet they were considered holy. They were considered dedicated to God. Sometimes there were portions of animals that were not burned up in sacrifice to God. Remember, certain parts of animals belong to God, and those were burned up. But there were also other parts of those animals that were left over that were still considered holy or dedicated to God. And so God basically tells Aaron and his sons and the Levites, these are yours. All these things that are left over that weren't offered up to me, these are the things that are going to provide you support. These are considered your income, so to speak. And so you would have had wave offerings, things like that. You would have, remember, the first fruit offerings were something that the children of Israel brought to God. There were also times when they brought peace offerings or gifts. There was also the idea of the redemption of the firstborn of males, both of humans and animals. And of course, God didn't want human sacrifice to him, but they were required to pay a fee for them, and that was considered redemption money, and God gave that redemption money to the Levites in order to help them have income and to provide for them. And so you have this idea, God, again, we're talking about millions of people here that are sacrificing and giving to God, and when you think about the Levites, they weren't a great tribe. I think if I remember correctly, I think there were about 8,000 people. Don't quote me on that. Look it up later. But they weren't a lot. And so you think about how much they would have had. Well, they would have been tremendously blessed. That's, of course, far from the idea of many people today that simply use the name of God to try to get rich. God didn't, he didn't give the Levites all those things so that they would be rich. But he certainly didn't want them to lack either. He didn't want them to have to go out here and worry about other things during the day. He wanted them to focus on this work or this spiritual service and taking care of the sins of the people. And so he made sure that they were adequately provided for by giving them those things. If you look in verse 21 of Numbers 18, it says, "Behold, I have given the children of Levi all the tithes in Israel as an inheritance in return for the work which they perform, the work of the tabernacle of the meeting." And so question number 7 on your handout is, what did the Levites receive for their inheritance? And the answer is, we just read in those verses, the tithes that the people brought. God gave those tithes to the Levites, and that was in return for their work or their service that they were doing within the tabernacle. And so, again, you think about that principle in the New Testament. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 9:14, God has commanded, this isn't a suggestion, but God has commanded that those who preach the gospel should live of the gospel. Those who work for God should get paid by the service, by the things that the people offered to God. You had that principle in the Old Testament. Of course, a principle that spills over in the New Testament too. I don't say that, I think you guys know me, but I don't say that because I'm disgruntled or I'm not adequately provided for. I think the elders certainly do that for those who preach the gospel here at Gospel Hill. But you think about the people. This is the way that it was supposed to happen. But did the people always do that? I mean, did they always bring tithes to the tabernacle and to the temple of God? Did they always give God his due? They didn't. And in those instances, when they didn't do what they were supposed to do, the Levites were the ones who suffered for it. In fact, when Nehemiah comes back and he's trying to rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, remember he's looking around in Nehemiah 9:13, and what are the priests doing? Well, they're out here working in the fields. And do you know why they're working in the fields, the Levites? It's because nobody was tithing. Nobody was bringing any sacrifices into the house of God. And so the work of God suffered because of it. God wanted those people to dedicate their lives and their time in service to him, and to focus on the idea of the taking care of the sins of the people. And he didn't want them to have to worry about every ordinary day jobs, going out and providing a living for their family. So question number 8 here on our handout is, why did the Levites have no inheritance among the Israelites? Remember, all these Israelite tribes, they get part of the promised land, but the Levites, they don't get an inheritance. They don't get land like everybody else does. They don't inherit these great vineyards like everybody else did. It's kind of explained there in verses 23 and 24 of Numbers 18. It says, "But the Levites shall perform the work of the tabernacle of meeting, and they shall bear their iniquity. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations, that among the children of Israel they shall have no inheritance. For the tithes of the children of Israel, which they offer up as a heave offering unto the Lord, I have given to the Levites as an inheritance. Therefore I have said to them, among the children of Israel they shall have no inheritance." And so the reason they didn't have any inheritance is because God had these laws in place. It was basically the law of daily support for the Levites. They got part of the sacrifices, they got part of the tithes, and that eliminated the need for them to have any land. I know we think of having land as, maybe kind of building up the empire or something like that, but land back then was a necessity. The reason that people owned land is so they could survive. They had cattle, they had vineyards, they had olive yards, they had fruit trees. All those were necessary for them to survive and to provide a living for their family. Well, since the Levites got sacrifices and tithes, they didn't need those things. And so God made that provision within that law of daily support for them. If you look at verse 26 in Numbers 18, it says, "Speak to the Levites and say to them, when you take from the children of Israel the tithes which I have given you from them as your inheritance, then you shall offer up a heave offering of it to the Lord, a tenth of a tithe." And so question 9 on your handout says, what commandments did the Lord give the Levites regarding their tithes? And the commandment was that they were supposed to take of that income that they received, and they were supposed to tithe from it. In fact, if you'll read some of those other verses in the rest of the chapter, you'll find that God told them, all these tithes that you get, you give 10% back to me. All these sacrifices that you get, you take the best of those sacrifices and you give them back to me. And I know sometimes people have this idea, well, I've dedicated my life to God. God doesn't want my money. But that wasn't the case of the Levites. You look at them. There was no other people or tribe in the Israel that served God more on a day-to-day basis than did the Levites. And even though they did that, God didn't excuse them when it came to giving their money to tithing like all the other people. He commanded it of them just like anybody else. When we get over into chapter 19, we read a little bit about the idea of cleansing. And in fact, in the first couple verses here of chapter 19, the Lord speaks to Moses and Aaron, and he says in verse 2, he says, "This is the ordinance of the law which the Lord has commanded, saying, Speak to the children of Israel that they may bring you a red heifer without blemish, in which there is no defect, and on which a yoke has never come." And so question 10 is, what requirement of the law did the Lord give Moses and Aaron? And that was the requirement of taking a red heifer. It was not supposed to have any blemishes on it. There weren't supposed to be any imperfections in it. It was not to have been used as ordinary, in any ordinary or common day service of man. There was no yoke that was supposed to have come upon it. And what they were supposed to do with that red heifer is they were supposed to kill it. They were supposed to burn it and save the ashes of it. And those ashes were supposed to be used for the purifying for making unclean people clean once again. Hebrews 9:13, the Hebrew writer talks about the ashes of the heifer, how they made people clean under the law, or under the law of Moses or the Old Testament. Well, that's the reference that he's talking about there. There were different ways that people could become unclean. One of the ways that we read about in chapter 19 is by touching a dead body or being around a dead body. And so if that happened, question number 11, the question is, what was a person responsible to do if he or she had touched a dead body? Well, that's where the ashes of the heifer come into play. Their responsibility was they were supposed to make sure that they were made clean, that they were cleansed. And of course, the way that they did that was by taking those ashes. They were to mix it in a jar of water, dip a hyssop in that water, and then that hyssop was supposed to be used to sprinkle that water upon the people. It was supposed to be done on the third day, and then again on the seventh day. And of course, you think about death, again, we're talking about millions of people. There would have been people, I imagine, dying on a daily basis. People didn't wake up in the morning and say, well, I think I'll become unclean today. But through the ordinary process of daily living, maybe it was coming into contact with a dead family member or a body, then those people were made unclean. And so when that happened, their job was to make sure that they became clean. And if they became unclean or they became defiled, then their job was to put forth the effort in order to try to be made clean. If they didn't do that, of course, they were cut off from among their people. We read about one man who was stoned to death. That's what the phrase meant, cut off there. And so imagine it would mean the same thing here. Question number 12 was, how could an unclean person be made clean? Well, we just mentioned the idea. You mix the ashes of the red heifer with water. The hyssop was dipped in the water, sprinkled on the people the third, the seventh day. And then the seventh day, that person was to take a bath. They were to wash themselves. They were to wash their own clothes. And then at the end of that process, they were deemed to be clean. And you have this idea here in chapter 19, this distinction between cleanness and uncleanness, this distinction between being holy and being unholy, and being clean or being defiled. And so the question is, 13, why isn't it possible for sin to mix with holiness? You think about the idea of how things are not, certain things can't be mixed up with other things. And one of the things that popped into my mind was the idea of oil and water. You can't mix oil and water. Their structure just won't allow it. Of course, there's a scientific, explanation to that. It has to do with the charge of the atoms that are involved in those elements. But the bottom line is, oil is attracted to oil and water is attracted to water. They're not attracted to one another. You can't mix oil and water. And you think about the Bible, there are certain things that you just can't mix together. Paul talked about it in 2 Corinthians 6. He says, you can't mix light and darkness together. They're not compatible. They're not attracted to one another. You have to have one or the other. You can't have compatibility, he says there in that chapter, with Christ and Satan. Why can't Christ and Satan get along with one another? Well, their structure's not the same. They're not made up of the same thing. He also talks about the idea of idols and gods. A God. Why can't idols and God, why can't you mix those two things together? Well, one's a real being and the most powerful being in the universe. The other doesn't even exist. It's a lie. And so you have this idea in the Bible, certain things just don't mix together. And when you think about sin and holiness, you can't be set apart to God. You can't be different. That's one of the ideas I often stress with holiness. You can't be different from everybody else, and be involved in sin. And so these people who were unclean, they had to be made clean, and certainly a great principle for us as Christians today. Well, I hope this study has benefited you in some way. And Lord willing, next week, start looking at Numbers chapter 20, and we'll go over the questions we have prepared for them next week, Lord willing.